Fourth Dream. Quote, "Oh, was some power the gifty gie us to see ourselves as others see us." End quote. Burns. Again did I find myself facing the same problem, this time with 10 lessons to guide me. I started off by sending our patrols as described in my last dream, but their orders were slightly different. All human beings were to be brought into our post, and any animals which could be of use to the enemy were to be shot, as we had no place for them. For my defensive post I chose the position already described in my last dream, which seemed very suitable for the reasons already given. We consequently dug a trench similar in plan to that already described, but, as I feared the possibility of guns being used against us, it was of a very different section. In plan it faced north generally, and was slightly broken forward to the front, each half being quite straight. In section it was about 3 feet 6 inches deep, with a parapet about 12 inches high in front of it. We made the trench as narrow as possible at the top, compatible with free movement. Each man hollowed out the under part of the trench to suit himself, and made his own portion of the parapet to suit his height. The parapet was about 2 feet 6 inches thick at the top and quite steep inside, being built up of pieces of broken anthill, which were nearly hard as stone. The patrols returned shortly with their bag of a few men, women, and children. The women indulged in much useless abuse and refused to obey orders, taking the matter less philosophically than their mankind. Here was evidently an opportunity of making use of the short training I had once had as an ADC. I tried it. I treated the ladies with tons of tact in my suavest manner, and repeated the only Dutch words of comfort that I knew, "Wacht ich bin je," and "Al zal recht komen," but to no purpose. They had not been brought up to appreciate tact. In fact, they were not taking any. I turned regretfully round to the color sergeant, winked solemnly and officially, and seeing an answering but respectful quiver in his left eyelid, said, "Color sergeant?" "Sir." "What do you think is the best way of setting a light to a farm?" "Well, sir, some prefer the large bedstead and straw, but I think the harmonium and a little kerosene in one corner is as neat as anything." There was no need for more. The ladies quite understood this sort of tact, and the trouble was over. The Dutchmen and Africans were at once digging shelters for themselves and the women and children. The latter were placed together and were put into a small ravine not far from the trench, as it was necessary to place them in a really deep trench, firstly to keep them safe, and secondly to prevent their waving or signaling the enemy. The existence of this ravine, therefore, saved much digging, as it only required some hollowing out at the bottom and a little excavation to suit admirably. All dug with a will, and by night the shelters for the women and children, men prisoners, and the firing trench were nearly done. All arrangements for the guards and sentries were the same as those described in the last dream, and after seeing everything was all correct and the ladies provided with tents to crawl under, as they had their own blankets, I went to sleep with a feeling of well-earned security. At daybreak the next morning, as there was no signs of any enemy, we continued to improve our trench, altering the depth and alignment where necessary, each man suiting the size of the trench to his own legs. In the end, the trench looked quite neat, almost as nice as mother makes it, as they say, with the fresh red earth contrasting with the yellow of the veld. As one of my reservists remarked, it only wanted an edging of oyster shells or ginger beer bottles to be like his little broccoli patch at home. Upon these important details and a breakfast, a good 2 hours had been spent, when a force was reported to the north in the same position as described in the previous dream. It advanced in the same manner, except, of course, the advancing men were met by no one at the farm. When I saw this, I could not help patting myself on the back and smiling at the Dutch ladies in the pit, who only scowled at me in return, and spat. The advance party of the enemy came on, scouting carefully and stalking the farm as they came. As they appeared quite unwarned, I was wondering if I should be able to surprise them, all innocent of our presence, with a close-range volley, and then magazine fire into their midst, when suddenly one man stopped and gathered the others around him. This was when they were some 1,800 meters away, about on a level with the end of the incidentamba. They had evidently seen something and sniffed danger, for there was a short palaver and much pointing. A messenger then galloped back to the main body, which turned off behind the incidentamba with its wagons, etc. A small number, including a man on a white horse, rode off in a vague way to the west. The object of this move I could not quite see. They appeared to have a vehicle with them of some sort. The advance party split up as already described. As all were still at long range, we could only wait. Very shortly, boom, went a gun from the top of Intendantamba, and shrapnel shell burst not far from us. A second and third followed, after which they soon picked up our range exactly, and the shells began to burst all about us. However, we were quite snug and happy in our nice deep trench, where we were contentedly crouched. The waste of good and valuable shrapnel shell by the enemy was the cause of much amusement to the men, who were in great spirits, and, as one of them remarked, were, quote, as cozy as cockroaches in a crack, end quote. At the expenditure of many shells, only 2 men were hit, in the legs. After a time, the guns ceased fire, and we at once manned the parapet and stood up to repel an attack. But we could see no Boers, though the air began at once to whistle and hum with bullets. Nearly all these seemed to come from the riverbank in the front, to the north and northeast, and kept the parapet one continual spurt of dust as they smacked into it. All we could do was fire by sound at various likely bushes on the riverbank, and this we did with the greatest possible diligence, but no visible results. In about a quarter of an hour we had 5 men shot through the head, the most exposed part. The mere raising of a head to fire seemed to be absolutely fatal, as it had been on a former occasion when we were attempting to fire at close range over a parapet against the enemy concealed. I saw 2 poor fellows trying to build up a pitiful little kind of house of cards with stones and pieces of anthill through which to fire. This was as conspicuous as a chimney pot on top of the parapet, and was at once shot to powder before they had even used it, but not before it had suggested to me the remedy for this state of affairs. Of course we wanted in such a case head cover and loopholes, and as usual I was wise after the event, for we had no chance of making them then, even had we not been otherwise busy. Suddenly the noise of firing became much more intense, but with the smack of bullets striking the earth all round quite close, it was not easy to tell from which direction this fresh firing came. At the time the men seemed to be dropping much oftener, and I was impressing them with the necessity of keeping up a brisker fire to the front, when I noticed a bullet hit our side of the parapet. It then became clear the enemy must evidently have gotten into the donga behind us, to which I had paid no attention as it was to the rear, and were shooting us in the back as we stood up to our parapet. This, I thought, must be what is called being, quote, taken in reverse, end quote, and it was. By the time I had gathered what was happening, about a dozen more men had been bowled over. I then ordered the whole lot to take cover in the trench, and only pop up to take a shot to the front or rear, but no more could be done by us toward the rear than to the front. Our conditions were the same, no Boers to be seen. At this moment 2 of the guard from Washout Hill began to run into our trench, and a terrific fusillade was opened onto them, bullets kicking up the dust all around them as they ran. One poor fellow was dropped, but the other managed to reach our trench and fall into it. He too was badly hit, but just had the strength to gasp out that except himself and the man that started with him, all on Washout Hill had been killed or wounded, and that the Boers were gradually working their way to the top. This was indeed cheering. So hot now was the fire that no one could raise his head above ground without being shot, and by crouching down altogether and not attempting to aim, but merely firing our rifles over the edge of the trench, we remained for a short time without casualties. This respite, however, was short, for the men in the right half of the trench began to drop unaccountably whilst they were sitting well under cover and not exposing themselves at all. I gradually discovered the cause of this. Some snipers must have reached